I just want to backtrack a little bit to, I can't remember whether I actually touched on it. I mean, I think I alluded to it, but whether I did it textually or not, I can't remember. So on page 70, I just want to call attention to the text on page 70 where he says in number 47, in the second line of the first paragraph of number 47 on page 70, decision is decision between either or, but that already forestalls what has the character of decision. From where comes the either or? Now, the either or we're very familiar with in modernity, right? I mean, Kierkegaard, of course, takes it to the ultimate. Where does this come from? From this, only this or only that? From where comes the unavoidability of thus or thus? Is there not a third, indifference, but that is not at all possible here? What is the utmost here, being or not being, and in fact not the being of any beings whatever, for example, of man, but rather the essential swaying of being, or why does it come down to either or here? The indifference would only be being of non-beings, only a higher nothing. For being here does not mean being extant in itself, and not being here does not mean total disappearance, but rather A, not being as a way of being and yet not, and B, in the same way, being, having the character of nothing, and yet precisely being. Taking this back into the essential swaying of being requires the insight into nothing's belonging to being, and only thus does the either or receive its sharp focus and origin. Now this is central. That last paragraph is really central to where Heidegger is coming from or where he's at, and it's a note that I tried to strike the very first day of this text, not of this text, of Being in Time, but in general of Heidegger, namely that, and he says in today's reading, happily, he actually says this. I didn't remember ahead of time that he had actually said this, but when he talks about Hegel somewhere in today's assignment, he actually says that he's going in the opposite direction to Hegel, right? Now, what he doesn't specify, but it's implicit, is that he's going from the opposite direction to begin with, right? In other words, he's not allowing the dialectic to begin, to start up. But if Hegel starts with being indistinguishably nothing, right? But only so in Hegel because it's indeterminate at that point in what becomes the first moment of the dialectic. Then Heidegger is starting, we say, with the first moment of the dialectic, as it were, except that first moment for him is not a dialectical first moment, right? It is somehow or other the worldliness of Dasein, and it is in the opposite direction, in the sense that in Hegel it is implicitly infinite being, and it becomes explicitly infinite being in the third moment, do you say? But in Heidegger, what is implicitly infinite being in the first moment in the Hegelian dialectic is explicitly finite being in Heidegger. So in that sense, as he says later on in today's assignment, he's going in the opposite direction in Hegel. But what we want to emphasize, he's going in the opposite direction before Hegel has a chance to go anywhere, right, so to speak. That's the key point. And so here, the relevance of this particular paragraph would be that that nothing belongs to being. All right, nothing is not, as it is in Hegel, an alternative to being. In other words, you could say, in Hegelian terms, nothing doesn't belong to being for Hegel, but in the sense of infinite being, certainly, right, or being as it's ultimately understood in Hegel, but nothing belongs to beings, if I put it in Heideggerian terms, right? In other words, it belongs to the second moment in Hegel, which is, remember, the fundamental logic is the universal, the particular, and the individual, and particularity has the connotation which Badiou picks up on. In other words, this is the connotation prior to the thinking now occurring, right? So Badiou is not wrong, is what I want to say, right? He's not wrong to associate the notion of the particular in the tradition, all right, with some as opposed to others, or this group as opposed to that group, all right? So if you politicize it, it becomes this people as opposed to that people. It becomes the Germans as opposed to the Jews, or whatever it might be, right? That would be the classic example in 20th century politics for Badiou, right? For that reason, among others, he's opposed, Badiou is, to the notion of particularity. I pointed out to you, I think last time in the course of going through this, that particularity in the context of the thinking now occurring is not associated with a people or a group, because here we have we've gone beyond the notion of self-consciousness, and therefore the particular, which otherwise is not the case in the self-conscious dialectic of Hegel or in Badiou's I don't know what, post scientific Marxism, if I can put it that way, for want of a better term, or maybe his post-Heideggerian Marxism, might be a way of understanding Badiou. In the thinking now occurring, there's nothing keeping, so to speak, particularity from being directly associated with, if I can put it that way, or identified might be a better way of putting it, identified with or as the singular, all right, and not as opposed to the singular. This issue comes up, I'm reading, it's another book. Okay, so to come back to the Heideggerian point then, Heidegger is still operating, although he's undermining the dialectic, in the way I'm using, the peculiar way I'm using the word undermining in this course. I'm using Heidegger's undermining of metaphysics as not, as he himself emphasizes, especially in today's reading, not as a simple rejection of metaphysics, not as an opposition to metaphysics, right? But it's a deepening in some sense of the, but only for the first time, unfortunately, you might say. Unfortunately, is the right term. For the first time, a deepening of the, or a grounding of the first beginning in a way that it was never for itself grounded hitherto. All right. So in that deepening, he then has in this deeper way, in this more originary way, Heidegger himself, and I want to hit this in this way of backstepping a moment, has a place for the role of the people, of the particular in that self-conscious sense, in some as opposed to others. He has a role for that, although he doesn't have a role for that uncritically, as I think we can tell from reading the text. All right, but again, back to zero in here on this particular middle paragraph on page 70, the key simple point, as he states it here, is that nothing belongs to being. And he said the equivalent on other places on page 82. Maybe we can just jump ahead to that if I haven't already hit it. Where on page 82, in effect, and I think I in effect hit this, maybe not page-wise last time, on number 7 on page 82, therein is manifest completely from afar the not knowing that the not, right, in other words, in the metaphysical tradition, it is not known, it is not acknowledged, it is not to the fore. The fact that what is clear for Heidegger, that the not and the nihilating belong to being itself, right? And in fact, it's kind of redundant. I mean, it's impossible. The language is impossible, no matter how you slice it. But it's redundant to put the hyphen in there because the not and the nothing that belong to being itself is what hyphenates that being in this translation. In other words, it's the not and the nothing belong to finite being is redundant. You understand? That's what I'm trying to say. It's probably an unavoidable redundancy. But anyway, the not and the nihilating belong to being itself, and the lack of an inkling of the finitude and uniqueness of being. This is the problem in metaphysics, understanding metaphysics, especially in the modern sense. But for Heidegger, also, the roots of modern metaphysics are in ancient metaphysics, going back especially to Plato. It's something that I would and do want to quarrel with, but it's not important enough to quarrel with it in order to understand Heidegger, right? For Heidegger, assuming there is some kind of fundamental continuity between ancient thought and modern thought, this what he calls a metaphysical tradition, and I distinguish that in Novitas Mundi, I think I mentioned before. I deny that modern metaphysics is a true metaphysics, right? But nevertheless, Heidegger, not making any reference to that distinction, assuming it's as true or somehow they're truly rooted in ancient metaphysics. Modern metaphysics is a problem for him, as ancient metaphysics is. And so that metaphysical tradition, I'm saying especially the modern tradition, has no inkling of the finitude and uniqueness of being. And so that's tied in with the more positive statement on page 70 that I started with.
David, can we
Yeah, sure.
quickly, just to clarify,
Okay.
why being, or why nothing belongs to being? Is it the? I mean, I know this is a review here, but is it the temporality and the finitude of being that is really the essential understanding?
Yes. In fact, somewhere in today's assignment, he says, speaking of time, that time is the truth of being. All right, and he's already said, I think, in Being in Time, that being is temporal. Right. So yes, that would be the temporality would be, if I put it that way, the concrete manifestation, or a concrete manifestation of the finitude of being.
Yeah.
Is that it? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah.
Okay.
If that's the gist of what should come to mind when we.
Yes. Now, of course, we have to be careful because temporality, as Being in Time makes clear, and as I would say is fundamentally assumed here. In other words, he's assuming being in time. Temporality here is not tick-tock time. It's not linear time simply in any Kantian sense, right? But it's temporality as the ecstatic structure of Dasein and the being of Dasein, the being to which Dasein belongs, and which fulfills the need, and the structure of Dasein as fulfilling the need of being. All right, all of that is ecstatic temporality, which in the case of Dasein concretely means that Dasein is being in the world already ahead of itself. In other words, that thrownness is in effect the again, maybe put a little quotations mark, it's the pastness, do you see? And the being in the world, do you see, is the presentness, and then the being in the world with the in such a way that being is Dasein is the being for whom is the being itself for whom its being is a concern, is at stake, is an issue, right? Meaning, therefore, that it has a potentiality to be that is not automatically given. It's not simply an actuality in the classical metaphysical sense. That's the futural nature, right? So it's out of that potentiality, out of that futural ecstasis, that the present of Dasein comes, which present, of course, is, as he says in Being in Time, is its past, right? It's being in the world, here and now, so to speak, is its being thrown in the world. It's having something behind it of which it cannot, in a certain sense, which it cannot grasp, because if it could grasp it, it would do what Waltraud dearly wants to do. It would get rid of it, right? But it can't get rid of its thrownness because it's part and parcel. So its pastness, in that sense, it's part and parcel of being there, right? But it's not the whole of being there, right? So there's the analogy to, I think I was making this analogy last time, but it's fundamental to my understanding of Heidegger, is it's the analogy to Hegel, right? That in Hegel, there is a pre-existent necessity. In other words, what freedom there is in Hegel takes place within the limits of necessity. So in terms of that little mental drawing that we're using here, that in Aristotle, essence includes existence. It surrounds. It's the limitation upon existence in Aristotle. Analogously, Hegel, who says of himself that he is Aristotle more deeply determined, right? The increasing depth of that determination in Hegel, nevertheless, is a recapitulation in a dynamic, dialectical, more deeply determined, post-Kantian, post-Cartesian way. It's nevertheless the structure in which the eternal actuality is the limit upon whatever possibility Hegel might reluctantly admit in the course of the working out, the temporal spatial working out of the creation. See that when all is said and done, the possibility that takes place in the reminds me of, we were talking before you came in of how do you say it? Zizek, his Hegelianism, right? he wants to kind of flatten out Hegel. I think that's it's a Marxian or materialistic Hegelianism, right? In which if you flatten it out, then you have a place for breaks and interruptions and discontinuities in the otherwise Hegelian dialectical recuperation and absolute self-knowledge of an eternal actuality, right? But that's to get it down more simply. That eternal actuality, in effect, operates as a pre-existing necessity, a pre-existing limit, you see, on whatever might be understood to freely transpire in the course of the creation of the Hegelian understanding of the creation of the world. Whereas in Heidegger, we were saying last time, Novitas Mundi places Heidegger along with Husserl and Kierkegaard in opposition to Hegel, the limitation being that Hegel in a certain sense has anticipated the opposition, and therefore, which is another way of saying that they are in opposition to Hegel without getting beyond the ground of selfhood, do you see? So if I stay within selfhood, even if I reject the ego of self-consciousness, the Cartesian ego and everything that flows from it, the absolute individual of Hegel, do you see, God as the absolute ego, even if I reject all of that, as Heidegger does, as long as I remain in the ground of owning, as long as I remain in owning, do you see, as long as being there is is constitutionally structured as self-referral, all right. As long as I do that, then Hegel still wins, right? I really haven't gotten beyond Hegel in a certain sense, and there's a sense in which Heidegger effectively admits that, right? By the undermining fact, the positive, the constructive notion that I'm trying to get across in this undermining, that he's not simply leaving it behind, you see. He's trying to more deeply ground the first beginning as part and parcel of the crossing over to the other beginning. Right? And that's one of the points I think he makes in a couple of different ways in today's assignment. Okay. Oh, so what I was going to say was, all right, but within that limitation, as we said earlier on in different contexts slightly, the weight of Heidegger, how can I put this? Heidegger's importance, relatively speaking, or maybe when I say importance, right, the depth of his philosophical analysis, even though I put him in a certain sense on a par with Kierkegaard and Husserl, I think the thrust of what I'm saying is to acknowledge that, relatively speaking, even though they're in the same camp in opposition to Hegel, and each of them takes a certain leg of that tripart opposition and runs with it, I want to say that Heidegger runs with the deepest leg, the most important leg, right? In other words, in a certain sense, Hegel, you can see it, especially you can see it in the case of Kierkegaard. Even so, now as I'm thinking, you can see it in the case of Husserl. Kierkegaard, yes, you could say he does a radical critique of Hegel. He certainly does, you see? But the fact that he has to characterize it as absurd, you see, he has to justify it in terms of an absurd faith, right? As the kernel of the now I'm starting to sound like Zizek and Lacan. That's the kind of the hidden kernel of his critique of Hegel, right? It's that absurd faith. Heidegger doesn't have to quite do that. And analogously, Husserl, in order to do, in effect, his critique of Hegel, his critique of the whole modern self-conscious scientific knowledge tradition, which is epitomized in Hegel, he does so by what? Not by absurd faith, but he has to bracket. You see, he has to bracket the substantiality of, or the existence of the world. You see what I'm saying? Whereas I think Heidegger doesn't have to make any one of those kinds of moves. In a certain sense, he is much closer to Hegel as critic, right? In other words, he's less removed, which I think he would be happy to hear. He is less right? In a certain sense, Kierkegaard is an abstraction. Kierkegaard critique requires an abstraction from Hegel. And Husserl's critique requires an analogous abstraction Do you see? A kind of scientific abstraction. It's not clear to me, and I think I'm saying in effect, I want to say in effect, I may have to take it back, that in Heidegger, there's no such abstract moment. There's no sense, he doesn't have to abstract from Hegel. In fact, he kind of turns the tables on Hegel, and from his point of view, Hegel would be the epitome of abstraction, right? Of an abstraction from the concrete finitude of being. Do you see? So in that sense, he is at once closer to Hegel, closer to, in a certain paradoxical sense, absolute self-consciousness, than either, in this philosophical sense, than either Kierkegaard or Husserl is, you see. I have to qualify this. I'm emphasizing in a philosophical sense, qua philosophy, qua, I want to say, constructive philosophy. So in one sense, he's closer to Hegel, and yet his critique takes the form of a shifting from absolute self-knowledge to masterful self-knowledge, right? And somewhat indebted there to Nietzsche, but most importantly, a kind of finite version of what absolute self-knowledge would be. What would be, right? It would be self-mastery on the part of the existing Dasein that you are and that I am, right? And the evidence of that self-mastery would be, in the context of this text, steadfastness and so forth and so on, or in the context of being in time, anticipatory resoluteness and so forth, right? And those would be the forms, in the context of the finitude of being, anticipatory resoluteness and steadfastness and related notions would be the finite forms of the eternal actuality, you see, the absolute presence of the absolute Hegelian idea, which is reflected downward in all of the constancy of the ego in Descartes, right? Or the constancy of the objectively present objects of scientific Kantian knowing, to say, okay? So we have constancy here, but the constancy is not the constancy of objective presence. So we have an undermining of the notion of actuality, would be another way of putting all of this, right? An undermining. So now to return to the larger point I was making about Heidegger, an undermining of the notion of necessity, but not altogether a dispensing with that necessity. So the undermined form of metaphysical necessity, absolute in Hegel, the undermined form of metaphysical necessity is thrownness, is pastness, is not being able to make, as the thinking now occurring understands it, a complete, unqualified break, do you see, essential break with the past, or, put it in theological terms, an essential break with the Creator, right? Now, the thinking now occurring doesn't understand that as a negative. That understands it as a pure positive, right? But nevertheless, it is a break. It's understood in the thinking now occurring in those, especially in the ethics seminar, and then following through in the morality seminar, as the. It's interesting in terms of another major issue I want to touch on here. In this discussion today of Heidegger, the question of causality. I found myself saying, I love it when I surprise myself. Then I know I'm on the right track, right? But when it's not planned, I know it's right, okay? And somewhere in the morality seminar, probably in the third seminar, I have a footnote in there, which I just put in, a footnote in passing saying something like the relationship between the creator and the creator is that omnipotence affects the creation without causing it, I say. Just say it's very interesting. And as I say, I had none of this in mind. And I don't think I've ever said anything quite like that before directly. I mean, it may be implicit, okay? But I found myself saying it in the morality seminar explicitly in one of the footnotes. And it's very relevant here to one of the things I want to focus on in Heidegger. He repeatedly, in fact, he's going to do it, let's see if I can, on page 77 is one of the places in which he does this. Let's see if I can, the abandonment of being on page 77.
This is the last paragraph.
Yeah, but I want to see, I just want to see, I have another note here. There's all these different little notes. Yeah, okay. The highest being, so you were reading my mind. Okay, but let's read into it from from 52, the first paragraph. Abandonment of being is strongest at that place where it is most decidedly hidden. That happens where beings have and had to become most ordinary and familiar. That happened first in Christianity and its dogma, which explains all beings in their origin as ens creatum, created being, where the creator is the most certain and all beings are the effect of this most extant cause. First of all, I want to just pause there. It's not that there's no truth in what Heidegger's doing. That would be too simple, too easy. That would make it too easy. Say it's wrong. It's not simply wrong. Because if you read Thomas Aquinas carefully, that is, if you read Thomas Aquinas having come out of the modern world, look, in other words, you're reading back into Thomas from the context of modernity, then you're going to see in Thomas the word certitudo appear, right? And in a certain sense, you might be mildly surprised to see that appear, but running the film the other way, since it appears in Thomas, although I don't think you're going to find it anywhere in Aristotle. I mean, I'm almost willing to, I'll put $5 on the table, so if we get the equivalent there, you're going to take the other, right? But it'd be good for you to try and find it, because then I would have to explain the text, so to speak, right? But yes, certitude is an issue in Thomas. It's not an issue as it becomes in Descartes. It doesn't become the whole issue, you see, but it's there, right? In other words, it's reared its ugly head. The more comprehensive way of which I put that is that in Thomas we already have, and this is the truth of Heidegger, right? Of Heidegger's analysis, or at least the context in which there's truth in Heidegger's analysis. We already have in Christian theology, we already have, and in Thomas taking him as the medieval apex par excellence, the medieval Hegel, so to speak, let's put it that way, that we have in Aquinas, we have the notion of God as ipsum, or suum ipsum esse, or ipsum esse suum, however you want to, Latin word order, doesn't make too much difference, right? In other words, suum, the reflexive, his own being itself, or so being itself, God is being itself for Thomas, which is something I want to pick up on vis-a-vis Heidegger. God is being itself, but yes, the being itself that God is in Thomas is qualified as suum, all right? So he's already using the reflexive self-reference, even though, as I always point out, there is in Latin no substantive nominative self, okay? The closest thing to it is ipse, which is really himself, which is really a reflexive notion. It can be used, it's a pronoun that can be used as a noun, but it is technically speaking not a noun, right? So, but the suum ipsum esse, as I point out, I think in Faith and Philosophy, when I'm comparing Augustine and Thomas, is already an approach to modernity, implicitly, not intended, right? It's the setup for modernity, compared, if you go back 800 years to Augustine, where the equivalent of esse ipsum suum in Augustine is very simple. It's id ipsum, which is not very Freud would like it. But it's very interesting. In other words, it. God is the very it, right? But there's something about id or it that says what? That I don't want to call it negative theology exactly, right? But you get the thrust of what I'm trying to get at. It's it, but it's not further defined, so to speak.
It's not a definition.
Huh?
It's not a definition.
Yeah, well, it's a kind of definition, but it's not very helpful, right? It's not very helpful, except that God is where it's at, we would say in modern terms, right? Absolutely it. He's the it. He's where it's at, right? Okay. That's what Augustine is kind of saying. Now, Augustine does specify that God as being, properly speaking, the only essence. So the it means to Augustine, in effect, essentia, right? But Thomas substitutes, in effect, for that id, esse. It's not id ipsum, it itself, all right? Or it's not even, therefore, if I say Augustine really means, as he would say elsewhere, he might, I don't think Augustine ever put the two words together, to the best of my recollection, but he may have, or he could have, let's put it that way. He could have said essentia ipsa, to say, or essentia ipsum, if he was taking it as a neuter, to say. He could have done that, but I don't think he does that. But that's what in effect he's doing, Augustine. Whereas Thomas substitutes for essentia, esse, what is normally translated as the act of being, and that becomes something of an issue in Heidegger's reading here too, okay? Now, so the point I want to make then is Heidegger's got a good deal of truth on his side when it comes to the history of thought, philosophy, or the history of being, but he allied some distinctions which make his understanding, I want to say, more possible than it would be if you don't make those elisions, and I'll come to that in a moment. One of them being here this notion of the highest being, which is on the bottom of this page. So if we come back into this page 77 in that top paragraph of 52, but cause-effect relationship is the most ordinary, most crude, and most immediate, what is employed by all human calculation and lostness to beings in order to explain something, to push it into the clarity of the ordinary and familiar. Here, where beings have necessarily to be the most familiar, being is necessarily and all the more ordinary and most ordinary. Now, he's going to, let me see where else he does this. Okay, well, all right, I'll hold that because it's easy to do. All right, so now he's focusing on causality. Causality is kind of his bogeyman here, okay? Because causality is a kind of easy way. I assume you noticed in today's assignment one of the other terms that he associates with, I think it's in the context of modern science, but then modern science would just be a kind of particularization of the whole of modern self-consciousness, metaphysical consciousness. Another negative term for Heidegger is explanation. You see? So I explain something, I explain it in terms of its relation to some pre-existing or presupposed entity or entities, God. So he said, what he's really saying is that modern science model of explanation is the medieval notion that God is the explanation for why the world is here. You see? Now, if you can get him to focus, and by the way, I'd like to have Heidegger. I'd like to have him in person because I like to go over the text with him and get him to focus, right? Because every once in a while, he gives evidence that he is aware of these subtle distinctions. For example, right, it's patently obvious that Aristotle needed no cause, no explanation for the being of the world. Do you see? All right? Aristotle did need a cause, if you want, an explanation for the motion that he experienced in the physical or natural world. He needed to explain that, and the unmoved mover is the cause of motion. That's the motion that we experience. That's where Aristotle was that. But the notion of the cause of being just wasn't on Aristotle's map. Okay, so to conflate, although I have to give part of the blame to Thomas, because Thomas has 5 proofs of the existence of God, right? And the first one is an Aristotelian proof from motion, right? There has to be a first cause of motion. So Thomas himself, you see, trying to be a good Aristotelian as much as he can, even though he's really got an understanding of reality that Aristotle didn't have, he uses as much of the kind of Aristotelian argument as he can, and so he's got ammunition for Heidegger in there. You see what I'm saying? Or he's got a notion of causal explanation for being, and that is in Thomas, you see. And so the real issue that I'm raising here is that all that can be said about Thomas's understanding about the relationship between the creature and the creature. Is it right is Heidegger historically correct? Although he has a lot of good grounds for doing so, which have been given to him by Thomas's not appreciating the danger that he was setting up, right? Why should he, right? Why should he be thinking 300 years ahead, right? So without intending to do so, Thomas has carried over, as best he can, at least in a formal and abstract way, much of an Aristotelian notion of causality, do you see? And has even applied it by analogy to God as cause of being. He has done that. Thomas has done that, right? So the question I'm raising is, yes, okay. So in that sense, the unbroken continuity between ancient metaphysics and modern metaphysics, there's a good case for that in terms of what Thomas has has done and what he has failed to do, so to speak, right? What he has actually committed by way of transmitting that ancient metaphysical formality, do you see? But then the question is, but I'm saying in Novitas Mundi, just in passing, I think I kind of explain it, but I don't write a whole book about it, that it's not true metaphysics. That's what I'm saying, right? All right, no matter what metaphysical tradition that you can find from Aristotle and Thomas, it ain't really metaphysics is what I'm saying, okay? It's formally so, but not substantively so, because substantively Thomas is an original thinker, as he must be, if he's going to really grasp creation ex nihilo, which Aristotle never dawned on Aristotle. You see, he's going to grasp that in some way intellectually, or it's going to affect the way he thinks. It's not going to show up in the abstract or formal borrowings from Aristotle. It's going to show up someplace else, right? It's going to, and we're not going to be surprised to find that it shows up precisely at the point where he describes, Thomas does, the relationship between the creator and the creature, and this is touched on explicitly in Faith and Philosophy when I'm doing Thomas on this issue, and I've probably mentioned it in here in one or another kind. The most common context in which I mention it is when I point out that Thomas potentializes the Aristotelian essence, because God adds to the essence, which essence in an Aristotelian universe had absolutely no need for anything to be added to it, because it was eternally divine actuality, right? So it was lacking nothing whatsoever. In the world of creation ex nihilo that Thomas is operating in the 13th century, that same essence, as it were, okay, now is not an eternal divine actuality. It's a creature. It's an ens creatum. Yes, it is an ens creatum, you see. And therefore it needs to have added to it, which would never even occur to Aristotle, esse, the act of being. So esse trumps essentia. So in terms of that little circle within a circle, now we have esse in place of the essentia that Aristotle would have had in the outer circle. We have esse, and essentia has been put in the middle as within the limits of esse. But now here's the paradox. To be within the limits of esse is a liberation from precisely necessity, from I'm using necessity now in this metaphysical sense. You see, the necessity of eternal being as the limit, the parameter, or parameters within which all existence takes place in Aristotle. Now, esse, as the act of being, you see, is, if you want, it's the limit on essentia, right? Which gets a little bit, you can see where the dialectic comes from. You see, it's kind of dialectical, inherently dialectical, right? The limit on essentia, the limit on eternal actuality is being created. But that limitation on eternal actuality, which is being created, is both in its origin and in its substance. This is what I want to get to. It's freedom. You see, in other words, it's placing in effect implicitly freedom prior to necessity. You see. Okay. Now, in the context of Faith and Philosophy, I say that the first moderns to get this, I mean, Thomas got it because he did it, but the first moderns to get it are the American pragmatists. Peirce gets this, right? Peirce, and I do it in the little box thing in chapter 7 of Faith and Philosophy, right? Peirce, it's not a personal idiosyncrasy on his part, right? In other words, modern American philosophy, pragmatism, reverses the order of necessity and freedom, right? And so freedom comes before necessity in American pragmatism in a way that's at least analogous to the priority of esse to essentia in Thomas. All right. So, okay, let's go back to the text here, because otherwise I just go off and it's all by way of context. So cause and effect relationship is the most ordinary. Okay. And so I found myself saying, which I think is right to point out, and it covers a multitude of details in Heidegger's text, especially in today's reading, that the model for scientific causality is really the theological causality of God causing creatures to be in Thomas. In the little 2 lines paragraph, and since now being is in truth what is most Now, all right, so that's the way it is. But the truth of the matter for Heidegger is that being, with the hyphen, is in truth what is most non-ordinary, right? It's most unique, do you see? Non-ordinary being here has withdrawn completely and has abandoned being. So to the extent to which we don't appreciate in the modern metaphysical tradition, and for Heidegger implicitly all the way back in one form or another to Plato, we don't appreciate the uniqueness or the non-ordinariness of being. Well, to that extent, being has abandoned beings. Abandonment of beings by being means that being has withdrawn from beings, and that beings have become initially, in terms of Christianity, only beings made by another being. The highest being, as cause of all beings, took over what is own most to being. I think I alluded to this last time. I don't know if we were on this page or not, right? But in effect, this highest being now has, in Heidegger's understanding, has taken over what... Yeah, I think I did mention it, right? Has taken over what is own most to being. It has made itself, or it has been understood to be responsible as cause of, responsible for the for finite being, right? For the finitude of beings. These beings, once made by the Creator God, then became of human making, and I think I would have alluded there, or should have, to Descartes, right? God is the artificer in the Meditation 3, who has placed his mark, the idea of God, his mark on the immaterial res cogitans, so that the mark on the soul that Descartes res cogitans is, that mark is indistinguishable from the soul itself, right? So what you might take is, if I actually make a mark, if I put my stamp, my my trademark on this table, if I made this table and put my mark on it, well, it wouldn't be coextensive with the table. The mark would be smaller. But Descartes plays with the fact that he's dealing with an immaterial product, the soul, and therefore when, if you place the mark on it anywhere, it's at once the whole thing, right? The part and the whole. It's an interesting thing that's going on there. Okay, so the highest being, cause of all beings, took over what is almost a being. All right, now the beingness of beings, the last sentence, fades into a logical form, into what is thinkable by a thinking that is itself ungrounded. Now, what I want to highlight, which I don't think I did last time, is the notion that of God as the highest being. In our more normal English, we would be talking about the supreme being. All right, and the question that arises is that an adequate understanding, in particular of Thomas's, because understand here that the thinking now occurring understands, as I've said colloquially a moment ago, in effect, I'm just saying it now, I think for the first time, that Thomas is the Hegel of the Middle Ages. All right, so if you buy the my Johnny Carson thing, if you buy the premise, you buy the bit. All right, so if you buy that premise, then you buy the bit, the sketch, right, the little performance. You buy the performance that it is not not an adequate understanding of Heidegger's part. If Thomas is the Hegel of the medieval understanding, it's not adequate to reduce Thomas's understanding, and therefore the medieval understanding, the Christian understanding. It's not adequate to reduce that to the notion of a supreme being, or that God is a being different from other beings by being the highest being, the supreme, effectively the metaphysical unmoved mover, the cause of being. In other words, is the cause of being, which is analogous to the cause of motion in Aristotle, is that for Thomas simply as it should be by analogy, a highest being, right? The unmoved mover in Aristotle is clearly the highest being. Do you see? And the analogous cause, not of motion, but now of the being of the creation, on the analogy to the prime mover, should be a highest being, that's what prime mover means in Aristotle, right? He is not the only unmoved mover, but he's the prime unmoved mover. So God, by analogy, as the cause, should be the supreme being, right? And the question raised, and the answer to which is no, is Heidegger's understanding of the Christian understanding of God using Thomas as our standard, is it adequate to understand God in Thomas as supreme being? No. The answer is no. All right. And again, in Faith and Foundation, Faith and Philosophy, I quote the passage, which somewhere in the Summa Theologica, to the effect that Thomas has the paradoxical statement that the relationship between the Creator and the Creator is one of a kind of infinite disproportionality, right? There's no proportion. The way Thomas puts it, which I quote in the text, but I think I can recapitulate it fairly accurately, is that the relationship between the Creator and the creation... well, let's start at the other end. The relationship between the lowest and the highest creature, now there you see, between the lowest and the supreme creature, that relationship, there is a supremacy there. Who is the supreme creature? By the way, he happens to be the devil, at least naturally speaking, right? Lucifer, in the tradition, was the highest, the most intelligent angel, right? So the relation, this is Zizek, his perversity would come into play here. We're going to skip all that perversity, right? All right. So the relationship between the lowest and the highest creature, says Thomas, here's interesting the way he puts it, he literally says, is as nothing. So nothing gets in here. The relationship between the highest and the lowest, the supreme and the most inferior creature, is as nothing compared to the relationship between the creature, he might have said the highest creature, he doesn't say that, between the creature and the Creator. All right? So in other words, the nothing is something that is confined to the relationship between the supreme and the inferior beings, do you see? But God is absolutely disproportional to that, and that relationship between superior and inferior is, in terms of understanding the relationship between God and His creation, it's as nothing. Right? There is no proportion, is the way he puts it, right? There's nothing but a complete disproportion between the creature and the Creator. So therefore you want to focus in understanding Thomas, even though, as I say, he gives fodder to Heidegger. Thomas's original understanding, I've got to put it that way, if I'm looking for the originality of Thomas's contribution to the history of thought, is the notion of suum ipsum esse, and I'm going to bracket the suum a moment because I've already acknowledged that itself is at least potentially problematic. But it's the ipsum esse I want to focus on here, right? God is being itself, not a being, all right? And being itself, and this is also relevant to the way in which Heidegger proceeds here, and there's a reason why he proceeds here, and it goes back to your question. Because being with a hyphen is temporality, or the structure of being is temporality, or it's space and time. That is, the being that Heidegger is dealing with is finite being, or being whose neediness and finitude is to the fore, not infinite being, okay, in any sense of the word for Heidegger, not infinite being as a, and therefore, what do I say? All right, I want to connect, I got to think what I was trying to connect there. Thomas and, being itself. All right, when Thomas talks about God as ipsum esse, being itself, he explicitly distinguishes, I mean, there's no have to read this into Thomas's text. This much he did anticipate, right? He explicitly distinguishes being itself from esse communis, or commune, esse communis, I think is the way he phrased it, from common being, or in, right? Remember, Heidegger is conducting here a continual attack upon the notion of being as something general and common, as opposed to, as he says, something unique and estranging. Do you see? So the notion of common being, or being in general, appears in Thomas's text. Do you see? Now watch this. Number one, as not what he's talking about when he's talking about the ipsum esse that God is. God is not the common being of the creation. Do you see? Is there a common being of the creation? Is there a being shared, as it were, by creatures? Yes, but it's precisely that. The common being is the being that creatures share. It's not to be confused with the divine being. That's the point, right? All right. So Heidegger's attack on the notion of so in a way Heidegger's attack is well grounded historically. In other words, what he's saying in effect, therefore you might understand him to be saying in effect that through Thomas the notion of beingness and then the notion of what becomes explicit in Descartes and in Hegel in different ways, the notion of beingness as the idea, right? The beingness of being, the idea of being, right? That notion is in effect, in some sense, at least I would say, although Heidegger I don't think makes the distinction, is at least partially rooted in Thomas's analysis or his metaphysical description, as metaphysical in quotes, description of the nature of the being of creatures. Right? There is a common being to creatures for Thomas. It is not the divine being. That's the major point I want to make here. Right? But if it is not the divine being, now here's the trick. If it is not the divine being, and this goes back to the essay which encompasses, encloses, and therefore paradoxically liberates what the essentia in the Thomistic notion of creation, right? In other words, how can I put it? The environment of essence all of a sudden becomes, in the light of Christian theology, the environment of essence becomes, the essay surrounding essence, the environment of essence now becomes what? Freedom. You see? It's immediately corralled by self-consciousness in Leibniz as possible essence, right? Freedom becomes possibility. Do you see that? The freedom need not be possibility, and what I would say is that in Thomas, the freedom of essay is precisely not the possibility of essence that it is in Leibniz, because in Thomas, the freedom of essay, or the freedom connoted by essay as the environment of essentia, is precisely act of being. It's precisely actuality. So freedom for Thomas is actuality, not possibility. Just so to say? Okay. But now I want to get even closer in there, and this is quoted verbatim in Faith and Philosophy, but it's very relevant to reading Heidegger's text. When I zero in on this creative act of ipsum esse, by which to use, see, this is part of the truth of Heidegger's analysis, because Thomas' basic way of understanding this metaphysically, so-called metaphysically, is that the created being's essay, which is the actual being of the essentia of the particular nature that it is, human essence, whatever, you see, that act of being, that created essay, if I can put it that way for a moment, right, that essay which is added to, as it were, added to essentia, in the case of the creature, as form is to matter, as it were, okay? That essay, I was going to say, in Thomistic terms, participates in the divine being. All right. So there is, that's a Platonic notion. That goes back to Plato's understanding of how the natural world participates in the idea. Okay. Now, finding myself saying that way allows me to right away make one important, not the only distinction I want to make here, but one important distinction is that even though the created essay in Thomas participates in ipsum esse in a way analogous to how in Plato, and this is the truth of, the partial truth of Heidegger's analysis, in a way analogous to the way in which the natural world, which would be the equivalent of creation in a Thomistic understanding, participates in the eternal Platonic ideas. Yes, there is an analogy. Except what? That ipsum esse for Thomas is by no stretch of the imagination an idea. Right? So yes, there is a Platonic-like relationship, participation of the creature in ipsum esse, but the analogy breaks down because the participation of the creature who has been created ex nihilo, whose essay is, as it were, added to, it's too mechanical way, right? But you get the idea. Is the actualization of what is otherwise merely a potential essence. That analogy to Plato, participation, breaks down precisely the point is that what the creature in Thomas is analogous to is a God who is not an idea. Do you see? Who is not, who is not an idea. Okay, who is being itself? Where being itself, ipsum esse, is not an idea. Now, how can I mean this now in I don't mean this in the barroom sense, we're going to have an arm wrestle, right? But how can I, as it were, show you, but I want to say more strongly, how can I demonstrate the truth of what I'm saying? Is that ipsum esse, to the extent to which it is true that it does, becomes an idea in Descartes. Okay? In other words, the difference between Thomas and Descartes is that Descartes, in his meditations, having unmoored himself from his experiential reality, his experiential temporal, spatial, bodily, corporeal world, from the world, right? Putting himself abstractly now in the place of the divine being as something being apart from the world, independently of whether or not the world exists. That's what the meditations are all about, only now we've reduced this theological issue, so to speak, to the issue of what turns out to be a human self-consciousness, but was at least a finite self-consciousness. Okay. Yes, for the res cogitans, this, what otherwise we might assume, we have to be very careful that maybe we shouldn't make this assumption, all right? But I'm going to make it just for the sake of ease. What we might assume is the ipsum esse of Thomas. What the Cartesian res cogitans has in mind is the idea. If it has the idea of it, if it has any notion of ipsum esse, it has it in the form of the idea of it. Do you see? And I said it has it in mind. I was taking advantage of our colloquial way of speaking, but this is quite literal in Descartes. It has it in mind, and now if I go back to what I was saying about Thomas, that ipsum esse is not an idea. Ipsum esse, now this is shocking. This is shocking. Is not what Thomas or any other being, any other creature could possibly have in mind. Because if you press Thomas, you don't have to press him too hard, at the beginning of the Summa Contra Gentiles, the other Summa, he's very clear on the fact that when it comes to knowing, having in mind, the divine essence, which we know from reading around in Thomas's text, is ipsum esse, being itself, esse, ipsum esse, that's his essence, that there's no knowledge whatsoever of ipsum esse. There's no, ipsum esse is never had in mind. That's why I say, even though I'm conceding, I want to take away what I'm granting to Descartes. When Descartes appears to have an idea of what in effect you would assume is ipsum esse, strictly speaking, he can't have such an idea. So all of a sudden we've got something else going on here. Do you see what I'm saying? Without any particular calling attention to it. He does define that idea of God as an idea of infinite being. Do you see? But this whole, now you see, but this whole, that little shift, and his having in mind what Thomas in effect has told us we cannot have in mind. Now, does that mean we have no knowledge whatsoever? No, because then we have the famous Thomistic analogy of being, right? We can have some understanding. How can I put this? We can't have the divine essence in mind in any unqualified sense, right? But we can have some understanding of the divine being by analogy, but the analogy, this is really strange. The analogy, there's another very famous distinction that Thomas makes, which I don't think we've ever mentioned in here. It's complicated. He makes a distinction between real relations and relations in reason. Thomas does. Okay, so we can reconcile what this impasse that I'm about to come to by understanding that for Thomas, when it comes to the real relationship between the creature and the creator, there is no proportion between the two. That was my little reference to Faith and Philosophy text before, right? Okay. but there are relations of reason. So the analogy, the analogy of being, the analogy by which we are able to have some understanding of the divine essence, which strictly speaking we cannot really have, we can have by analogy as a relation of reason, right? In other words, we can have also to give some support to Descartes, right? So in other words, Descartes is taking that aspect of the distinction that Thomas is making, that there are relations of reason that are not to be simply equated with real relations in reality, and the relations of reason, since we're rational, are not irrelevant to us. They're not useless. They're not worth nothing. They're valuable to us because we're rational beings. So you can understand the meditations of Descartes, you see, as in effect confining himself to what he can understand, what he can have in mind, but what he has in mind is not now this is a technical way of putting it, not the real relationship between the creature and the creator, but it's the rational relationship between the creature and the creator. How it is possible for a creature to have some understanding of God. Well, Descartes takes that. But now you see what has happened, as I'm putting it that way, I have to conclude, therefore, according to this analysis that I'm going through, that Descartes, willy-nilly, that is whether he intended it or not, de facto, you see, has launched modern science on strictly within the limits, reminds me of Kant, strictly within the limits of reason. Do you see that? Strictly, in other words, I was thinking when I don't know whether I was driving or sitting on my couch this morning, I can't remember, but somewhere earlier today, I was thinking, and then I withdrew it, but I'm going to do it anyways, and then I'm going to redraw it at the same time. It's because I think, not properly understood, it's dangerous. The danger is that it might be an oversimplification. But what's leading into this detour, which is to come back again, is that if Descartes, willy-nilly, has reduced God to the idea of God, that is, the understanding of God within the limits of reason, anticipating religion within it comes to the same thing, really, you see? It comes to the same thing. Another way of putting that is, and this relates to Kant's rational reading of religion, in terms of medieval exegesis. You know there were 4 ways of reading a text. Are we familiar with that? The literal, the allegorical, the spiritual, and I'm saving this to last. It might have come actually second. I've included these things on an updated version of the ethics index. The last one that I want to focus on is the moral. Right? So when I read Scripture, the moral reading is no matter what it says, I apply it to myself. Right? Now, if you think of Luther, that's what Luther did. Right? In other words, and this is foundational to modernity. It's as if, now that's why I say it's an oversimplification, so I don't want to be taken literally. Okay? But the thrust of it is, which I think is correct, that another way of understanding this rational, this reduction to the limits of reason of the medieval, and in Heidegger's terms, the Christian understanding of God, reducing it to the limits of reason, which in effect is already done by Descartes, willy-nilly, okay, is another way of putting that in terms of exegesis, and you can see it both in Kant and in Luther, is to reduce the understanding of God to the moral mode of exegesis. So in other words, what is God? How shall I understand God in terms that are relevant to me? Right? That's where Luther's really at. I think Luther says something like that. What is Christ? What is Jesus except to me? Right? So that's a very bold statement to say. It's very subjectively oriented, right? But these are all different ways of talking about the same thing. So the big picture I'm trying to contextualize here is that Heidegger not only doesn't escape from, but he actually plays upon, this restriction to the moral dimension. I mean moral now in this technical sense. I don't mean
to self.
Self-referral. So that's the moral dimension appearing in Heidegger's text. Moral in this technical exegetical sense. And it's set up for it. So again, it's not that. So rational animal, for example, is a good example that he likes to use as the metaphysical understanding of man, which in a certain sense goes from Aristotle through Thomas. Right? Thomas had no problem with rational animal as far as that goes, you see what I'm saying? If that's all there was, then Heidegger would be simply right? But what I'm suggesting is there's more to it that has been cut out by the move by Descartes moralizing, I mean not in the technical sense, rationalizing mode. Okay. Now what's the point I was going to make? Well, I probably already made it.
But certainly Heidegger's aware of the trajectory of what you just discussed, winding up in a kind of the closure of rationality and
yeah. I was saying and he's running. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So a rational animal. Rational animal would be a concrete example of the fact that Heidegger, again, not rejecting the metaphysical. He's not opposed to it. He doesn't understand it as simply. What he's really trying to do in crossing to the other beginning is, as part and parcel of this, I think I said some moments ago, he's at the same time understanding a grounding hitherto not done, a grounding for the first beginning. Right? So the crossing to the other beginning is at once a grounding of the first beginning, right? Which the first beginning, as it were, did not do for itself. Okay. But then I wanted to make the general statement. So the most comprehensive statement probably is, it's not a rejection of reason, it's a grounding of reason. Not a rejection of the rational animal, but a grounding of the rational animal. An understanding of how it was possible for this understanding to come into being in the first place, right? And that it has, in its own way, some truth of being, you say, but it's not, I guess you could say, that the truth of being that the metaphysical tradition has, or that reason has, or rational animality has, or God as cause of being, if I limit my understanding to that, it's not that it has no truth of being whatsoever, but it does not, the truth of being that it has is not, I think in Heideggerian terms, the ownmost truth of being. And the ownmost truth of being is the needfulness of being and the finitude of being. Right? And that's what is buried over and obscured by this notion of infinite being. Okay, so here the highest being, the supreme being. And by the way, as a matter, when I was doing some research on this issue, just to make sure that I wasn't crazy, I noticed that Anselm. This is so interesting. This is so interesting. Now that I'm saying this out loud, Saint Anselm is the guy who was important philosophically. Is that Anselm is the guy who gives the classic original version of what is called the ontological argument. That argument, which I deny in Faith and Philosophy, by the way, but for Hegel and everybody else, presumably is the argument that is used by Descartes in the Fifth Meditation, right? And I'm saying that is not. What I actually say, in effect, is that the so-called Cartesian ontological argument, which is the argument from the Fifth Meditation, number one, it depends upon what Descartes calls the foremost argument for the existence of God, which is the argument in the Third Meditation, which is, now, it's interesting, it's great. You think I'm lecturing you, I'm lecturing myself, I'm listening to this, it's just amazing, right? Which Third Meditation is an argument for causality. See? Descartes' clearest demonstration that God exists is there must be a being in reality that could cause my having an idea of infinite being, because I'm not an infinite being. Where would I get such an idea if there wasn't really such a being, right? But notice his knowledge of the reality of the infinite being is mediated to him by, and it's his only access to, is the idea he has of that infinite being. You see that? So the idea is this is perverse, the narrow gate through which modern man has access to the divine is through his own idea of the divine. You see? Which, now watch, see, Hegel's waiting in the wings. Which own idea, Descartes says, well, no, my own idea of the divine can't be my own idea of the divine. You see? I have an idea of the divine which is my own, but it's not my own, right? So now we've got the dialectic is waiting in the wings there, right? And the undermined dialectic in Heidegger is what? Getting beyond oneself, you see, to what? What in effect is a true self, a true understanding of being, the truth of being, you see? So getting beyond the truth of the metaphysical truth of being, which was not originary, right? Which passed over the originary truth of being, if I can put it that way, the finitude and needfulness of being, is getting from the what in effect, you see, Hegel makes it perfectly clear. What is the infinite self of consciousness? The infinite self-consciousness of Hegel, right? It's undermining that and showing that is an abstraction from, or going too fast, or burying over, or obscuring, forgetful of an oblivion, making oblivious the finitude of the self, of selfhood, you see, which finitude of selfhood, in effect, coincides being. Okay. All right. So really, when he says that the highest being took over what is own most to being, and there's a lot of depth in that, to which it's not easy to do full justice.
Do you think that he's intentionally, those three sentences, that the highest being as cause of all being, that's explicitly Aquinas, and then these beings once made by the Creator God then became human making, that's explicitly Descartes? And then
yes. That's a good point.
Being fades into logical form, is that Kant?
Now let me take a look at. I want to remind me where we are.
It's the bottom of 77.
Yeah. So before I say yes too quickly, became of human making, right? You said Descartes for that.
Descartes, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And then the logical form, would that be Kant, maybe? Or maybe that's less clear.
Which is thinkable by thinking that it's itself ungrounded. Yes, I think so. Yes, that sounds like Kant, because then we get to the notion that yes, we have these ideas in Kant, but these ideas are not objects of knowledge. Right. They have a merely regulative function in knowing. Yeah, that's good. And by the way, because we can do that. I think it's useful to do that. But understanding that the distinctions we make between Descartes and Kant and Hegel, while they're real, are in one degree or another already there. I mean, in other words, I think they're shared understandings where the emphasis. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay. What I was going to do was turn over to 88, where this issue from another angle is approached. Here he kind of fesses up a little bit. On page 88, he's talking about machination. Now, machination, of course, would be the furthest rampant extension of this idea of creating as producing, as making, as God as artificer, as creator, and so on. Okay. He says on page 88, I would say, well, let's start about the middle. However, there it says, however, since at the time of the first beginning, physis is disempowered, machination does not yet become fully manifest in its own most. It remains hidden in constant presence. Pardon me. So, in other words, I guess what I want to say is what would bear a lot of discussion, more than I want to devote to it here. But if we had Heidegger here, we want to go over this more slowly, because notice what he's doing here is he's saying that machination was there from the beginning. He's saying, in other words, that the production of being that we can clearly and explicitly associate with Christian theology, at least as read through the narrow gate of the idea of Descartes, right, of what he, right? Heidegger's assumption is that machination was there all along implicitly, right? So he shares with Nietzsche the notion that Christianity is nothing real. He shares it in a little more critical way, but the uncritical, the crude assertion of Nietzsche that Christianity is Platonism for the masses, right? So in other words,
he says that too.
Yeah, he mentions it, right? So again, the absence of a recognition of the break between Platonism and Christianity. The justification for not noticing it is we have to chalk that up to Thomas's, not Thomas personally, understand, using him. In other words, that medieval theology carried forward Platonic and Aristotelian modes of understanding. I would say an untrue but formally structured metaphysics, you see, and Heidegger, so that gives Heidegger the truth of his analysis, all right? But the Novitas Mundi is all about trying to indicate that that's too easy, too simple. It's more complicated than that. That formality. If I focus on that to the exclusion of ipsum esse, for example, then I've missed what is really new, the new reality, as I phrase it in Novitas Mundi, that is introduced by Thomas in the history of thought. All right, but to come back here, so machination. So it's machination is there all along. It does not yet fully manifest in its own most. It remains hidden in constant present, whose determination culminates in entelecheia, Aristotle's term for actuality, within inceptual Greek thinking. The medieval concept of actus already covers over what is almost to the inceptual Greek interpretation of beingness. It is in this connection that what belongs to machination now presses forward more clearly. All right, so and here I don't think there's much to disagree with, except that it's only part of the disagreement is that this is the truth of this is a partial truth, not a complete truth. So in medieval thought, what belongs to machination presses forward more clearly, and ens becomes en creatum in the Judeo-Christian notion of creation when the corresponding idea of God enters into the picture. Even if one refuses crudely, and now he's kind of taking back all of his crude previous things there, even if one refuses crudely to interpret the idea of creator, in fact, I'm almost willing to say here, it's an overstatement, but let's put it this way, the less crude Heidegger's reading is, and he's going to give us his least crude understanding of what the problem is, the less one would be inclined to confuse the God of Thomas with a being. All right? Now I say he doesn't go all the way, but he goes in that direction. In other words, all right, so we don't have a God with a big white beard and so forth. We don't have the relatively crude notion of Descartes, the image of God as an artificer, right? Putting his stamp on it. That's kind of crude. Right? So what's the essence of that? What I'm objecting to is what Heidegger is saying here. It's the idea of causality. Okay, causality probably does imply, certainly by analogy to Aristotle, and probably inherently implies a being as the cause. So I think you probably can't get rid of it. But if you don't want to focus on a being, causality will do it, right? That's the real culprit, is what he's saying here. Even if one refuses crudely to interpret the idea of creator, what is still essential is beings being caused, right? The cause-effect connection becomes the all-dominating. God, now here he does it again. I'm sorry. I hate to be, you don't like to be picky, you know what I mean? You don't want to be picky. But he does it again. God as causa sui. Now, is God causa sui? Yes. For whom? For Spinoza. Okay? Not for Thomas. In no way. This is clear. This much is clear. God may be the cause of the being of ens creatum in Thomas, right? But God is not the cause of himself. Now, the fact that God is not the cause of himself is my lead-in to what's missing here in Heidegger, right? Now, this is a little bit subtle, but it's quoted textually in Faith and Philosophy when I'm quoting Thomas on this issue. At that point, which I was starting to say before, when esse is as it were, I won't use added, that's too mechanical. When esse is understood by Thomas to be the actuality of essentia, which otherwise, therefore, in that relationship, taken in and of itself as pure potential being, when esse is the actuality of essentia in Thomas, Thomas says that in this act of creation by which the essentia has its act of being as participation in the divine esse, the divine active being by participation. Remember, that in which it participates is not as it would be in Plato. Esse is the actuality of essentia in Thomas. Thomas says that in this act of creation, a Thomistic subtle exegesis here, who's doing a very Hegelian exegesis in the negative, Kierkegaard says, well, if you tell me God became man, me being a good modern subjectivity, even though I'm in rebellion, subjectivity, a Hegelian inside out and in rebellion, you tell me that, what you're telling me is that which that is the eternally unchanging enters into time, necessity, do you see? He says, no, nothing necessary comes into being, and then the other part of it, which the thinking now occurring does not share with him, that nothing by coming into being becomes necessary, right? Nothing that by coming into being takes on actuality, right? Becomes eternal, right? Now, does he believe that, having said that nevertheless that actually occurs? Of course he does, but it makes no sense, right? In other words, it's clear metaphysically and ontologically that that's impossible. Now, if you want to believe it, fine, but you need to know that what you believe is absurd. That's Kierkegaard's basic stance as an author. Okay, so what I'm saying, so to go back here now, so the being, causa sui, so that's a good negative way of getting to the point I'm trying to make. So not only in Thomas, now watch this, not only in Thomas is God, even when he is the cause of the being of the creatures, he is that cause of the being of creatures by their participating in his act of being. Do you see? Participating in it, and here's what I want to say. So really, as opposed to simply rationally, so really participating, and how does he know this, by the way? By faith. Only this faith for Thomas is not yet absurd. Okay? Not yet absurd. He knows by faith that the creature's act of being participates in the act of being of God. So let's put it this way. He knows by faith that the act of being of the creature is the freedom of the creature, that is its freedom, in a certain way, its freedom, that it has by its participation in the divine freedom. So in effect, to put it really straightforwardly and simply, what Thomas understands to be really going on in the act of freedom is that God shares with, then bringing creatures into being, he is sharing with them his freedom, which is his essay, his act of being. Right?
And why is it not the causa sui, which you were associating with Spinoza? That's what got.
Because. Okay. Because Spinoza comes after Descartes. I mean, there are a number of ways of doing this. He comes after Descartes. So Spinoza is running out one possible, Leibniz runs out the other major possible implication of Descartes. Spinoza runs it out in this direction. If, thanks to Descartes, my understanding of the relationship between the creature and the creator has been narrowed down to the limits of the idea, the limits of reason, as Kant will later say. Do you see? And if, it gets a little complicated now, if Spinoza has already made a major leap forward, Leibniz has done it in his own way too, but Spinoza has, both Leibniz and Spinoza should be understood as major advances on Descartes in what ultimately will become the direction that Hegel embodies. All right. So what I'm getting at is that if we look at Hegel, I think it's fairly obvious in the case of Hegel that the Cartesian consciousness, finite consciousness, that is and has, is the idea of God and has the idea of God. But has it in a finite mode, and therefore I want to say has it tentatively, which is all that, which serves Descartes' purposes. His purposes are very modest, right? He just, right? He has no absolute pretensions, right? But if that consciousness that is and has the idea of God, which it does, becomes absolutized thanks to the contributions made in different ways by Spinoza and Leibniz in Hegel. One of the implications of absolutizing that finite Cartesian consciousness is that I am now, as Hegel makes perfectly clear, absolutely confined to the idea of God, and the idea of God contained within the Cartesian consciousness, but attributed to something outside of, prior to that consciousness, right? Now that that consciousness has been absolutized, is now in relationship to the absolute idea of God that that consciousness is, that which has caused itself to appear in its finite mode.
The idea is the finite mode of...
Well, it's both. That's the point in Hegel. There's the infinite spirit of which the finite spirit is, it's redundant, is the finite addition, right? So Napoleon, to be political about it, right? Napoleon is, at a certain moment in the history of the world, he is the, as it were, the spiritual embodiment of the world spirit, of the absolute idea, understood as a world historical being. Do you see? So what I'm getting at is that self-causality comes in. See, it's not there in causality is there in Descartes, but self-causality is not there except in the negative. He says to himself, or another way of putting it. Okay, if you go back and read the analysis in Faith and Philosophy, which I recapitulate, Descartes' problem is simply this. It's a really simple problem. I have all these ideas, and he just proceeds this way, almost without, I want to say without thinking, right? Not quite true. Thinking without thinking. Well, I could possibly be the cause of all of these ideas. That's his first move, right? In other words, I have all these ideas in my head, and they may be just things that I've invented. I am the cause of all of these ideas. Oh, wait a minute, there's one of these ideas that I can't be the cause of. Do you see that? So the first instinct of Descartes in his self-consciousness, finite self-consciousness, is to think of himself as the cause of everything he thinks about. Do you see that? But it's a modest stab at being divine, right? It's not really explicitly that stab. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
But it's the setup for it, right? He's saved from that, from confusing himself with the divine, because there's one idea he can't account for, right? But if I were to now jump ahead and absolutize that idea, do you see? Or another way of putting it, yeah, well, how does causa sui, how does how does Spinoza in effect prefigure the ultimate absolutizing of that idea that we find in Hegel? How does he prefigure it? By saying, in effect, there's only one substance. That's what Spinoza says. I mean, to put it, you want to make it real simple, right? You want to take your test on Spinoza, you can be out of the room in 10 minutes. 5 minutes, a minute, you can be out in a minute. What does Spinoza say? There's only one substance. It's called God. Everything else is a mode of God. Do you see that? Well, if there's only one substance, then there's no room now for something beyond Descartes' finite consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. And therefore, Hegel will make it clear because he'll bring in the subjectivity of Leibniz, and he'll meld that Leibniz and Spinoza together there, triggered by his impatience with Kant, and he'll create an absolute self-consciousness which is the cause of itself, but he will add to it in causing itself, it causes, huh?
Gets to know itself.
Well, it gets to know itself, but in causing itself, it causes the world as the alienated or ideal moment of its own being, as that which it divides from itself. That's a rather long-winded answer, I think, to your question. Yes?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay. Oh, you mean it's long-winded? Okay.
And an answer.
Okay. The latter is the key point. Okay. All right. Now, so what did I? Okay. So I think I've basically said what I want to say on that page. Therefore, and the other thing on page 88, which I just I alluded to it last time, but just to pin it down in the text. And now hope I can put it down. Yeah. In the further up on that page, in the long paragraph, in that same long paragraph, but toward the beginning of it, Heidegger says, in the context of the being question, this word does not name a human comportment, but a manner of the essential swaying of being. Even the disparaging tone should be kept at a distance, even though machination, and this is another part of it, in other words, it's not a question of dismissing the first beginning, it's a question of grounding it, right? So we want to get rid of any disparaging tone. Even though machination forces what is not own most to being, now here's the thing I wanted to nail down, even what is not own most to being should never be deprecated because it is essential to what is own most to being. So here is the undermining of the Hegelian negativity, the Hegelian metaphysical understanding of the not. But does Heidegger agree with Hegel in this primordial realm? Do you see that the nothing and the not belongs to being? He does. Except the being that it belongs to now, do you see, is a being. All right, maybe I want to correct that way of phrasing it. It's not so much that in Hegel the not and the nothing belong to being, as they do in Heidegger, except by analogy, all right? But I almost want to say they are used in the dialectic to establish the infinity of being. In other words, it's probably not technically correct to say that in Hegel the not and the nothing belong to being in the Heideggerian sense, because when the not and the negative belong to being in the Heideggerian sense, then being is, by definition, finite and needy. All right? But that's the undermining of the Hegelian notion. I think I can do it. I hope I can do it. It's so simple if I can get it out once. In Heidegger, the negative and the not and the nothing belong to being immediately, directly, or in his language, originarily. In Hegel, I could say, which I did, so I'll say it again, the negative and the not and the nothing belong to being, but precisely not originarily, not immediately, but only as mediated through beings. All right? Only as mediated through the world of time and space into which, going back to the end of being and time, into which spirit falls of necessity in order to come to absolute self-knowledge, right? Right? So out of its own necessity, it falls into time and space, into the created world, and in that fallen state, it experiences, and in that sense, in the fallen state, the not and the nothing belong to it, but that's not the original state of being. That you see, in other words, when it recoups itself, it recognizes that the not and the nothing belong to it only insofar as it is alienated from itself, not insofar as it returns to itself, right? So that you could say that and this goes back to another point that I was trying to make last time, and I want to try and make it again on a number of places in today's assignment, so I'm trying to make it comprehensively. It's a little tricky. It's tricky for me to articulate it, although I think it's clear what it is that is difficult to articulate. I think this is it. In Hegel, so along the same lines, in the context of what I've just said, in Hegel, one could say, more comprehensively in terms of Heidegger's analysis, that in Hegel, the not and the nothing and the negative properly belong to beings. In Heidegger, the not and the nothing and the negative properly belong to being. And how dare the metaphysical tradition appropriate to beings the nothing that belongs originarily to being. You see? That's where it's really at. And the reason I think it's a little bit difficult to say it succinctly, and I think I just managed to do so, so I hope the tape is getting it. It's a little difficult to say because it's the difficulty, I think, is arising from the fact that what you've got here in this undermining of the dialectic. In other words, there's a kind of echo, a kind of residual of the dialectic, which is pretty straightforward in Hegel. You see, but now to reclaim that, right, for the truth of being, right, is a little difficult to articulate. But I think I've done that, right. So the nothing is going to belongs. The nothing belongs to being, but in Heidegger it originarily belongs to being, and therefore being is hyphenated. Being is finite to begin with. Do you see? Whereas, yes, the nothing belongs to being in Hegel, but only as mediated to it by beings, which in turn are the middle ground of being's dialectical process of self-knowledge. That's fundamentally the difference here, which I'm trying to call attention to. Okay. All right, let's move into today's assignment. I think we should do that. And I've already alluded to the negative cast of explanation in the first pages there having to do with science. I wanted to highlight on page 105 something he says, which again I think has comprehensive value here. Beginning at the bottom of page 104, all of history as discipline, in German would be Historie, as opposed to Geschichte. Yeah, okay. So history as a discipline, as a academic or intellectual discipline, is nurtured by comparison and serves the expansion of the possibilities of comparison. So another thing that the Thinking Now Occurring likes about Heidegger is that in his antipathy to explanation and his antipathy to causality, even though and I'm not going to repeat it, right? Well, we have a lot of questions to raise about the history of the notion of causality. But the Thinking Now Occurring has in common this, as it were, antipathy to the notion of comparison. So, or put it positively in Heidegger's terms. So whenever he's talking about the unique, you see, implicitly he's talking about something that is not comparable to something else by definition, right? Or it's only negatively comparable, I guess you could say. See? So in that respect, the Thinking Now Occurring also, in terms of its notion of absolute particularity, a kind of absolute particularity, that's at least analogous to Heidegger's impatience with the notion of comparison, and therefore his impatience with the notion of explanation, because explanation he understands in effect to be based on some sort of comparison, rather than dealing with the ground that presents itself, as it were, if that's the right term, that shows itself, probably a better term, in the thing under consideration. Modern science skips over that and contents itself, you see, with an unoriginary understanding of being in relation to prior beings. The a priori is another dimension that he's, in some sense, objecting to, as it's understood metaphysically. All right, but of course, the a priori has its post-metaphysical, its fundamentally phenomenological understanding in the idea of thrownness, of a kind of pastness, of a kind of being ahead of oneself, right? There is a kind of operative priority here, but it needs to be undermined. It needs to be understood in its more originary sense. But let me come back to this text at the bottom of 104. Although comparison apparently focuses on differences, so he's into difference, but what he's saying is that comparison is not really into difference, right? Yet differences for history as a discipline never become a decisive differentness, and this means never become the singularity of the unique and the simple, in the face of which history would have to recognize itself as insufficient. if it could ever come to face the unique and the simple. So in the thinking now occurring, uniqueness is where it's at, simplicity is where it's at. And so what is the difference between the thinking now occurring and Heidegger? Well, the big difference is that the thinking now occurring is essentially not self-referring, okay? But the flip side of that is that insofar as Heidegger's passion for differentness, which he, as far as it goes, he shares with the thinking now occurring. Insofar as he has a kind of passion for uniqueness, do you see? And therefore, as far as it goes, so what's the difference? It's precisely that the self-referring nature is keeping that differentness or that decision. See, he's saying that metaphysics never gets to essential differences. I think he says that maybe in today's assignment, or if he doesn't say today's assignment, he's already said it explicitly. Says that, right? It just doesn't get to essential differences, right? It doesn't get to an essential. It doesn't get to an essential decision. Do you see? Now his decision, as I think I anticipated last time, in the leap into Dasein, which is the same thing as the leap into the between, which is the leap into the between. That is the leap in effect into the crossing. That is the between the first and the second beginning. All of that leaping, that is the decision for Heidegger. But what does that decision entail? Not making the decisions that a metaphysical, pre-leaping comportment is in the business of making wholesale, right? Over and over again, making all these little decisions, right? Okay, never making the decision, right? Okay, so the decision, the kind of the paradox here, is that the decision of the leap into the between is to refrain from, here comes the steadfastness, the self-control, the anticipatory resoluteness of being in time, is to refrain precisely from making decisions. You see? All right. But does he, in refrain from making the metaphysical-like decisions, make the one necessary decision? Absolutely. Okay? Now, here's the problem. The thinking now occurring loves decisions, like Heidegger. Yes, this is good, this is very good. But notice Heidegger has to segregate his one necessary decision from all the particular little decisions that are now associated with the truth of being, when the truth of being is not originary. All right? In the thinking now occurring, do you see? All of those decisions, as it were, they get made willy-nilly. Do they? And so why do they get made in the thinking now occurring? They don't get made in Heidegger. Why is the decision an alternative to making decisions? Okay? And the answer in Heidegger's case is just an application of the answer in the case of modernity. Namely, what's holding it back? Or why are we still in the crossing to the other beginning? Right? When it's clear what has to be done, so to speak, and when I can decide in some fundamental sense to go beyond myself, as he would say, to go beyond oneself, to go beyond myself, to go under, to surrender, to sacrifice, in the context of the crossing to the other beginning, when I can surrender myself in any kind of narrow, selfish way, paradoxical language, right? All of that is nevertheless what? Nevertheless, is the effective, and here he shares something in common with pragmatism, right? In a different register, right? The effective postponement of arriving at the other beginning. Do you see? We never get out of the crossing to the other beginning, even though that's new. That's an historical new event for Heidegger. He makes that clear earlier in the text, right? It's new. Historicity is never the same for Heidegger. It has a kind of unique moment we're in, you see. But that moment, we're in the middle when the goalposts are still distinguishable. That's the point. And the thinking now occurring, we're in the middle, as it were, where those goalposts are no longer distinguishable from the middle, right? And that's the point in which we actually make decisions plural, right? Where the decision is not an alternative to decisions. And I think the fundamental reason for that is that the decision, in the case of thinking now occurring, is not one that we have made. That we have made. In other words, it's not original. Right? That goes back to something I was commenting on last time. This is just to tie in the language to what I'm saying now. So the reason I want to say we're perpetually in the crossing, and I even want to load perpetually there with all the good meaning that it has in the thinking now occurring, because perpetually is particularities, perpetual, seeking through to the particular point, not just the abstract universal. So we're perpetually in the crossing here. We got a unique being which is constitutive of the uniqueness, you see, of individual Daseins and so forth and so on. But that perpetualness, which is otherwise a good thing in the thinking now occurring, is a perpetualness, the context of which is a crossing. I made the distinction, very abstract distinction, just for the sake of clarity, although you'd always have to modify it in any given part of the text, between that if in Heidegger a being is unique, it nevertheless is not unicity. To say, that's what I'm driving at analogously, all right? There is perpetuity in the loaded quintillion sense of the word that the thinking now occurring understands. There is particularity, do you see? But it's not absolute particularity. Okay? There is the decision, but it's not I guess I want to say it's not, there is decisiveness, right? But there is even the imperative for decisiveness, I would say, in Heidegger here. There's an imperative operating here. This is what one, not morally, but if one is thinking, this is one ought to do this, one ought to leap into the between, one ought to do it. There's an imperative for decisiveness, but what we don't have here, despite the fact that there is an imperative for decisiveness, is we don't have the actual imperative for decisiveness, or the imperative for decisiveness as the actual, or we don't have absolute decisiveness. It might be another way of putting it in terms that enable us to relate to Heidegger's text. Whereas the judgment, the finality, the necessity after the fact of our creating the world, you see, is something like what I'm trying to point to here in terms of a kind of the absolute decisiveness that begins in the thinking that is the thinking now occurring.
How does this word that he uses, in abiding, work? I mean, is in abiding a kind of attitude of self-mastery, of self-control that's kind of containing oneself in that particular place of resoluteness, I forget the other.
Well, yeah, I think it has that connotation. I think it has I characterized it abstractly when the question first came up. Has a transitive connotation, so it has the notion of the kind of commitment, the kind of leaping, the kind of entering into the abiding. So it's not, in other words, it's not simply a passive.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. What I wanted to go back to this particular paragraph that I was quoting from on page at the top of 105. I said it out loud, but I want to just say it explicitly. This history as a discipline he characterized as effectively an insufficiency in the face of the unique and the simple. Okay, so what he's driving at is this originary thinking, this thinking the truth of being, of the finitude and needfulness of being. That is, how can I put it, the only form of thinking, or that is the form of thinking that is sufficient for the uniqueness and simplicity that it's pointing at, right? Okay. It's in today's assignment, just along the lines I was just referring to on page 107. He actually uses the phraseology that I was alluding to.
Today's assignment is actually later than 107.
I'm sorry.
Today's assignment, we're already in 150.
Well, we go. Yeah, I mean, this is
from 100.
From 100.
Okay.
We're into it. Yeah, we're into it. We're not far into it, but we're into it. he says in the middle, in the paragraph beginning right below the middle of 107, genuine historical thinking will thus be recognized by only a few, and let's see, am I going to get the right? Yeah, well, okay, in effect. Genuine historical will thus be recognized by only a few, and from these few, only the rare will rescue historical knowing all the way through the general hodgepodge of historical, that is, in the sense of the discipline, opinion, to a future generations being ready for decision. And there you have another example of what I mean by this kind of postponement. All right, genuine historical thinking. There's somewhere on this page, that I just can't see it with my eye now, he uses the phrase essential decisions, I think. But that's certainly what he... Yeah, there it is. The end of the top paragraph. Those for whom everything depends on merely rescuing what has been up to now. That is the history as a discipline, right? As opposed to Geschichte, as opposed to actual being. Those for whom everything depends on merely rescuing what has been up to now, i.e. on hindering essential decisions. So when I get to the truth of being, or the thinking that thinks the truth of being, then I'm in the position to make essential decisions, he says. But notice, you see, again, what I called earlier on an analogy to pragmatism, the postponement, you see, of essential decisions, certainly in the plural. There is the decision of the leap into the crossing. But the making of essential decisions is really something that a future generation is going to be ready for, if you look at the fourth line of the next paragraph. You see what I'm getting at? So there is this kind of, Kierkegaard would have fun with this. Kierkegaard could, if he had the patience for it, Kierkegaard would make an analogous criticism of Heidegger that he makes of Hegel, and namely that the system in Hegel, even though, so we don't have the system in Heidegger, we're undermining the systematic nature of modern metaphysics, but we're undermining it, we're not dispensing with it, we're not saying it has no truth of it at all. You say, we're not Hegel. Heidegger is not Hegel, even though he's undermining Hegel, and he's got to be consistently in undermining Hegel, so he can't say that there's no truth in Hegel. Because that's what Hegel would say if Hegel was in his position. See, you understand? So he doesn't say that there's no truth in Hegel. He says that the truth of Hegel is not originary truth. It needs to be undermined. That's Leahy's terminology, right? It needs to be thought in terms of the truth of finite being, of the finitude of being, right? And if it's thought in those terms, then it has a truth which is not the truth. Not its own truth historically, you see, but it's a truth that it precisely didn't have in having its own truth, right? Okay.
I have a question.
Okay.
Which has to do with the postponement.
Yes.
Of the crossing, and he's often speaking about those who are yet to come.
That's right.
If he is in fact waiting for another generation or more generations
right.
in which this thinking will germinate.
Yeah, there's a kind of expectation that there will be those who will be closer to it. Right. Oh, that's what I was. Well, you're helping me come back to my Kierkegaardian critique. My Kierkegaardian critique was that yes, we're in the crossing. Well, let's put it this way: we ought to be in the crossing, and I use that ontological ought. We ought to be in the crossing if we're thinking the truth of being. We're in the crossing if we're thinking the truth of being. I think that's clear. And that crossing is a crossing to another beginning. But we are temporal spatial beings. This is not an abstraction from time. It's quite the contrary. This being, this movement, this mode of creating, right? This authentic mode of creating, if I can put it that way, is temporal spatial. He makes a comment in passing today about this is not Buddhism. Okay, all right. So this is, in that sense, it's very Western. That's another thing which I wanted to. I've skipped over it now, but I'm sure you noticed there are a couple of places, either in today, certainly in last time's assignment, and maybe again today, where he speaks of rescuing or saving or salvaging what, in effect, I'm not quoting him verbatim, is the truth of the West. Do you see? Okay. And my critique of that is, well, I understand it. I certainly understand it, and it does have its truth. Okay, it has its truth. I mean, Heidegger's statement has its truth, but it has the truth at the same level in which it continues to be true for Heidegger, that it's proper to speak of an historical people, even though we're not quite clear who that is, who that might be in Heidegger. Nevertheless, the people have a historical role, at least in principle, in Heidegger. So the West has that historical role, right? But in the thinking now occurring, even though that would be acknowledged, that role of the West is in the past in the thinking now occurring, right? It is no longer the case that thinking, the truth of thinking, if I can put it that way, is Western thinking. Huh, that's about as simple as you can put it. Right? But of course, you understand, if the truth of thinking and the thinking now occurring is no longer Western thinking, well then, it's otherwise than Western thinking. That is, it's neither Western nor Eastern. Do you see? That's the, you want to talk about leap, I would say. If there were, it's not a leap, okay? But if it were a leap, it wouldn't be a leap into, because going down is pretty easy. It would be a leap up, okay? It would be a leap to that, as it were, level. I'm speaking metaphorically now. That level, that plane of being, you see, which is the distance, which is no distance, from West and East, is effectively equal. I'm reminded of the disproportionality between the creator and the creature in Thomas, right? In other words, you can't measure a distance of what is, as it were, the move, if it were a move, to the thinking now occurring, and whatever you might imagine that distance to be, the difference in the distance between the move from East and West would be, if I can paraphrase Thomas, as nothing. So whether your East is your supreme being or your West is your supreme being, the different you pick your favorite, and then one is the supreme and the other is the inferior. The distance between East and West. Now I'm thinking of Rudyard Kipling. The distance between East and West is as nothing. Paraphrasing Thomas, as the distance between the thinking now occurring and all self-consciousness, whether in a positive or a negative mode. I guess that's what it comes down to. Okay, but we want to make cover a little more ground here. So, yeah, I think I want to go to 120. There's some important stuff on there. Around 120, 121. There's so many. These things are all tied together.
Do
Yeah.
you want to just skip completely over this question of experience?
I don't want to skip over any questions that you have if I can answer them. Go ahead.
Well, there seems to be a lot of subtlety with the notion.
Yes, he makes a lot of distinctions between different notions of experience, right? I'm not going to look at the text now. I'm just going to give you a rough, what I think roughly he's doing.
Yeah.
So, for example, Aristotle's understanding of thinking and science, knowledge, in the Aristotelian sense, begins with experience of the world. That's almost a platitude in terms of Aristotle, right? But that's a kind of a natural experience. Then you have, for example, I think he mentions the kind of pre-modern, maybe late medieval notion of scientific experience, where you're testing things, you're looking at things closely to see if you can learn something from it. So there you're having a kind of an experiment, right? And then he has more subtle gradations and distinctions. But I think the bottom line is that he comes up to the distinctive nature of experience and the experiment that incorporates scientific experience in the modern sense, that modern notion of experiment, on page 114 and 115, where the basic notion is
it presupposes or has a theory.
Well, it has a theory, and yes, it has an expectation. That's right. You might say it has a hypothesis, but I think he wants to say something more concrete than that, and I just want to see if I can find the term that must appear somewhere on this page. And in the fourth line. So experiri is grasping ahead to what is sought, and that means what is inquired about as such, right? So that's the hypothetical aspect, right? We're looking for something, we know ahead of time what we're looking for, so to speak, right? Correspondingly, it is the arrangement and ordering of the procedure, but all this is not yet the modern experiment. The deciding factor in modern experiment, and here he tells us what that is, testing as probing, okay, is not the apparatus as such, but the way of questioning as the concept of nature. Experiment in the modern sense is experientia in the sense of exact science. Because it is exact, therefore it's experiment. I would zero in on the notion of probing. It reminds me of Dewey. Dewey, by the way, in a much more positive and affirmative sense than Heidegger. Obviously, Dewey is into science, right? For Dewey, genuine philosophy, or the best philosophy, is the philosophy that is embodied in the scientific method, as Dewey characterized. And if you read Dewey on the scientific method, he's in effect, on that point at least, is in agreement with Heidegger. In other words, the real nature of science is, in his language, probing. In other words, or I don't know whether Dewey has a word for it exactly. I can't remember what word he might use, but it's the notion of introducing into the environment a change, right? In other words, in that sense, if I probe, if I stick Todd with a pointer, right? When I probe him, so to speak, right, he's going to react to that. He's going to change his position. He's going to pull back or whatever. You see, so that's the notion that Dewey and Heidegger understand. That the real essence of science in the modern period is this disturbing of the looking, introducing change into the otherwise static situation. I think that's the essence of it. Now that's in addition to in other words, it doesn't discount the apparatus, but in other words, what he's saying is that merely having an apparatus, merely setting up an experiment in an external sense, doesn't tell us the whole picture. The purpose of the experiment is to provoke a change in Dewey's terms, I think,
And
right?
then-
To probe,
and
and
see
then to draw conclusions from it based on how what happens lines up with what the pre-existing state of affairs was, or my expectation, or what I was seeking, whether doing this gets me what I'm looking for. I mean, it's almost a commonplace when you think of physics, all this atom smashing. I mean, what the hell are they doing? I mean, there's these big kids with these mile-long rocks that they're smashing things, right? And they're looking to see what happens, right? Now they have some vague ideas. You see, they have some ideas of what they would like to see happen, and so forth and so on. But what they're really doing is breaking up things. Only we don't see them now, right? But it's like, and I remember Hegel says that. Hegel has this understanding too. He says that when a kid destroys a toy, has Ava gotten to that stage yet? Starting. Okay. Well, now you need to know. You need to know. Don't get upset. Don't give her any grief, because when she starts smashing her doll to pieces, she is demonstrating her rationality. That's what Hegel says.
How's that?
That's her. Oh, you're a more advanced parent, right? You've already been through this, and now you should go back and make a mea culpa. You say to to your son, is it your son? Daughter. Well, you'd say, Daddy learned in class today that you were really being very rational when you did all that destruction.
They always let her destroy it.
I usually let her destroy.
Okay, well, so then you have she has a rational father, right? In the scientific sense, right? That, in other words, this is not it seems like destructiveness, but it's the attempt of the human mind to discover what's what. Okay. Now, the problem is you can't put it back together. That's another problem. Okay.
Can you just make the
Yeah.
connection between what does that tell us? And so we've come to this conclusion that modern science and experiment has a notion of probing or change.
Right.
What does that tell us about mechanization, or about why? What is the implication here?
Well, actually, he says at the
Right.
end on this page,
Okay.
before he goes to 1, 2, 3, he says, which is more certain, the immediate and naive description.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And
Right.
There's some implication of why he's bringing all of this up.
Yeah, the implication would be, that's helpful. The implication would be, in other words, this is another example, what I call going too fast. I mean, in other words, he questions this experimentation, this probing, and the way in which he questions is to say, well, maybe the immediate and naive description, the less theoretical approach, might be more revealing. If I were to come upon my experience in the mode of the logos of being in time, in letting things be, rather than taking what in effect is a kind of violent approach. I mean, this is violence,
Sure.
you see?
Yeah.
So a non-violent approach here might be more revelatory. But of course, Heidegger's typical way of saying, well, who would ever think such a thing?
Yeah.
Meaning we ought to step back and think about that, right? So it's a critique of the scientific method, which is otherwise justifies itself, of course, in terms of, as he points out elsewhere, in terms of its results. So in other words, why would you challenge this way of knowing the world? Because it produces all these wonderful results. Now, of course, you could question what is the ultimate value of these results, and then he more deeply questions what is the, I don't know whether he would put it this way, but what is the value of valuing things, right? In other words, we value the results, or these results are good because they're valuable. They have they're useful to us, and so on. Toward what end is what he's asking, right? And another way I think he characterizes modern science is that it is, in the deepest sense, goalless, and modern consciousness is goalless. And he defines nihilism. Nihilism is not simply being without a goal, but it's the unwillingness to admit the goallessness, to acknowledge the goallessness. That's the nihilism. And related to that, he mentions today, I couldn't help but notice it, since the first level of deficient, virtue is the right word, the first level of deficient ethical behavior in the ethics index of ethics is boredom, and he says that the ultimate outcome of this unending, efficient, result-producing scientific probing of the world is going to be complete boredom, total boredom, he calls it, right? Now, I thought, now this is, again, an oversimplification, but when I read that, I thought to myself, well, now, in the context of the thinking now occurring, what otherwise might be construed as total boredom, especially if you import into the notion of, in other words, the thinking now occurring would be much more friendly in one respect. In other words, it's not, thinking now occurring is not trying to undermine science, right? It's trying to, if you want, or it is, in being beyond X, it's beyond science as a knowledge that distances itself from its object. So in that sense, it shares with Heidegger a disliking of the notion of presence and absence, right, and objective presence and so forth, right. On the other hand, as you know from the language of the thinking now occurring, it has no problem with the notion of objectivity, all right. So if you have an objectivity that is otherwise than presence, neither an objectivity of presence nor absence, right? If you have an objectivity which is a matter of creating the world, then the thinking now occurring is not going to have any problem at all with science, although it would have a problem with a science such as modern science, for which the object is present. Okay, it would have, right? Okay. So you have a science that has objects that are not present, which are created. Do you see? Here and now, absolutely. And in that being created here and now, absolutely, if I can finish this thought, what are we talking about? The
TNO and science.
Yeah, but his boredom. But in the thinking now occurring, where existence is absolutely now, where temporality is not, on the analogy to Augustine, a Heideggerian distension in the form of an ecstatic temporality structure of being in the world, you see, where creating the world is absolutely now, where creating is absolutely now, then here's what I wanted to say. What otherwise, in this context, would be, in other words, what Heidegger is saying is if science was the whole answer, the ultimate upshot of it is absolute boredom. The thinking now occurring wants to say, if there were a science of the world which was not a science of objective presence, a science which was absolutely objective, i.e., a science that was essentially creating a new world for the first time, then, in that context, absolutely now, there would be no time for what, granted, would otherwise be total boredom. You see what I'm saying? Okay. You know what I'm saying? In other words, if one was, I don't want to use the word constantly, you see, the temptation, the habits of mind, but if one was here and now creating, there would be no time to be bored, because there would be no reflection upon the fact that I did something like this before. That would not be of the essence of what was going on. You see, there would be no temptation to think that there was nothing new under the sun at all. You see, something like that. Okay, so I killed that bird there with one stone. Another, something like that, or two stones. Along these lines, in terms of the undermining of modernity, he says here on page 123, and analogously he says something related to it on 138. I don't know that we need to look at that, but let's look at it on 133. Speaking of Kant and Hegel and so forth, at the bottom of number 88 on 123, at the bottom of the page, the historical lectures belong to the sphere of this task, to make manifest Leibniz's unfathomable manifold shaping of the onset of the question, but to think Dasein instead of monas. Now, I think you would know probably from Novitas Mundi, but you may know from your own reading of Heidegger, that Leibniz is very important to Heidegger in terms of the history of thought, because Leibniz was the guy who asked the question, why is there being rather than nothing? And Heidegger brings that up, and then he says, well, of course, I'm not quoting him verbatim, but in effect he says, well, having asked the question, Leibniz ran off in the direction of being, right? And let's take another look at that question, but instead of following Leibniz in the direction of being, and Leibniz was the metaphysician par excellence, you see, up until Hegel, let's go off in the direction of nothing, right? Let's take that nothing seriously, and that's the historical background to the finitude and needfulness of the being of this text, you see? Okay, so when he says we're going from the monos, what we say in English, the monad, okay? You remember the monad in Leibniz is that being is distributed in the form of the monad, and the monad by definition is substantial being, the chief characteristic of which is that it is one of many, right? There are many, infinite number of monads that are, however, each of them, I said that you see that Descartes sets up this problem when he is the idea of God and has the idea of God, when the part and the whole are distinguished and yet they're, right? The whole contains the part, but the part that the whole contains is the whole in miniature. Hegel's waiting for that. Okay, so Leibniz has that same problem coming out of Descartes, and so every monad for Leibniz is the whole, the universe. How does he reconcile that every monad, every particle, substantial particle of which the universe is composed, is the universe from a certain perspective, from a certain point of view? So it's the whole, but from so I have all these monads. Each of them is the universe, but from a particular point of view, as it were, from a certain point of view. And you could say that again. So the monad now is undermined, right? So the undermined version, if I can put it that way, of the Leibnizian monad is Dasein. Understand, individual Dasein is the monad. You see. And the point of view, we would understand, is also being undermined here, right? So the point of view is comes out affirmatively in the context, let's say, of anticipatory resoluteness, as that one. I think we can say, fairly speaking, even whether he put it together at that point in the text, I can't remember. But in effect, that one, I was going to say, necessary and unique possibility in any given factual, actual, factical actual factical situation that you as this individual Dasein encounter in the moment of anticipatory resoluteness, it becomes clear to you what is that one possibility as opposed to all the other chance possibilities that you might otherwise become enraptured with if you were dealing metaphysically with yourself or the world that you're in. But if you're dealing with it originarily, then you could say, I want to say by definition, anticipatory resoluteness discerns the one necessary possibility that applies to you in this moment. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's the undermining of the point of view that is peculiar, or you might say unique to each of the Leibnizian monads. You see? So the particularity, Leibniz has got particularity. He's into particularity, and who's his bête noire? I don't mean literally, I don't think he was concerned about it, but we look back, who's the alternative? The one guy, Spinoza. Spinoza's into, there's nothing but the one, and Leibniz is into cranking out monads, each of which is unique, do you see? But his uniqueness is a metaphysical uniqueness, the point of view. Well, let's undermine that, and we get something like individual Dasein in the moment of anticipatory resoluteness, understanding the one possibility that is necessary for it, and not being distracted into what otherwise would be an infinite set of possibilities that don't apply to it.
But with no substance.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes, if we can use that term in quotes. Okay. Okay. So, all right, and that you can look at yourself on 138 about further a little bit related to that notion. Then I want to get over here to 7. All right. So on page 125, I don't think we need to dwell on it. The great leap off is the great leap into Dasein, which I think I pointed out to you last time. Effectively, if you put it all together, is the leap into the between. Dasein is the between, as well as, yeah. And in that sense, the leap off, the leap off is, can I put it this way, precipitated by or occasioned by, well, in Being in Time, by angst. But in the larger beingscape of the Beiträge, it's occasioned by the abandonment of beings by being, right? And the authentic response, if I can put it that way, to that abandonment is the leap off into the between, right? The leap off into being there, because being there has, it's not just the pointing; it's the whole thing of being in the world, right? Ahead of oneself, already thrown, the thrown thrower in the context of this thing.
So the thrownness is the between from this perspective. For being in the world, truly or authentically being in the world is the betweenness. If one was to leap fully into Dasein.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I'm a little careful, but I think that's right in the sense that the thrownness. Okay, I would just qualify it this way. Yes, broadly speaking, thrownness, originally understood, is the between, or being in the between, or being in the crossing in some sense. But you have to qualify that with this notion that he's already articulated, that history or historicity is itself unique. In other words, it changes. It's not always the same. So that, yes, there's a sense in which the between has always been there, but it has been buried over in the first beginning. All right. So, but that's right. In other words, there's no sharp break here, right? So but now we are at an historical moment where that coincidence or that identity, if I can use that word, of being thrown and being in the between are, as it were, explicit in a way that has not previously been the case. But this is all part and parcel of the same picture, right? In other words, it's the truth of the being of the first beginning was not original in that originary sense. You understand what I'm saying? But that's part and parcel of the crossing over to the other beginning. So yes, but you would need to add the uniqueness of the moment here, which is not simply maybe this is the one way of defining it, maybe oversimplifying, but again, the emphasis in being in time, I would say, is relatively individualistic. Relative to here. In other words, notice here, mankind enters into Dasein, right? The emphasis is much more, somewhat less individualistic, even though there are going to be those individuals who, on behalf of man founding Dasein, who belong to the future, right, are going to kind of lead the way, as it were, right? But I want to say the corporate or the human nature aspect of Dasein as a whole is relatively more to the fore here, I think. Right? So in that sense, then something is occurring to man here that has not occurred before, right? So whatever. If you want to say the between has always been there, yeah. But man now, as such, he is the call to enter into that between, something like that.
There's an awareness now that there hasn't been before.
Yes, that's right. This historical moment, as it were. Okay. Notice on page 141, he uses the expression here. Again, I don't know whether I can find it exactly. He's talking about the I, and somewhere around here, I can't pick it out with my other eye.
On the top of 141.
But the particular phrase I'm looking for is the will to certainty. He defines the I here somewhere as the will to certainty, and
it is at the beginning of 141.
Yeah, is it?
Yeah.
Is that phrase there?
Well, if that is the phrase.
Okay, well, from
it
the
speaks about
primary certainty, right? And it's the will to certainty that I want to. Anyway, whether I find it here or not.
It's under between B and C. There's that begins with origin. The end of that sentence. Origin of the priority. See down.
Origin of the priority lies in the will. Okay, the priority of the ego lies in the will to certainty, which is being certain of itself, being dependent upon itself. All right. So one way of characterizing in Heidegger's sense, which I think is probably quite correct, is that modernity. If you go back to Descartes and think about it, that resolve of Descartes, right, is the will to certainty. And I was thinking as I was reading this of some of the phraseology that I use in the context of the critique of Nietzsche in Faith and Philosophy. Nietzsche is into the will to create, as opposed to the will to think or believe in the pragmatic sense of the Americans. But elsewhere, I don't know whether I have page 108. So you have to go back. I'm not going to go back now. 108. Heidegger speaks in terms of undermining the will to certainty. That's my main thesis here. He's undermining modernity. He's not leaving it behind. And he's not saying that this is the fulfillment of modernity, as Hegel would have said. So he's neither... Okay. He speaks on 108 of the will to mindfulness. So if mindfulness is where it's at, then Heidegger... the self-referral means that Heidegger has not gotten beyond the willfulness that's to be associated. And we see this in resoluteness, anticipatory resoluteness. It's not the resolve of Descartes, as he points out, I think, someplace in Being in Time or wherever he uses the term resoluteness. It's not resolve in the metaphysical sense, but it is the undermining of resolve, right? It is the undermining of the will to certainty is the will to mindfulness, right? It's not a question of being certain, do you see? But it is a question of, as it were, discovering in the form of a masterful self-knowing, as opposed to an absolute self-knowing, discovering what is the possibility among all others that is necessary in order for Dasein to be what it potentially is. Right? What is that unique and, in that sense, necessary possibility? Right. So mindfulness here is again sharing will with certainty. Mindfulness is the undermined form, the Heideggerian undermining of the notion of certainty. There is a kind of originary certitude here going on here, right? As opposed to, see, here the emphasis is on the abandonment by being of beings, but in the thinking now occurring in a totally different sense, there is a complete abandonment in the productive reception of being. You see, in leaving behind self-consciousness, this not only the Cartesian resolve, but the Heideggerian resoluteness is left behind, right? Which I think reminds me of the distinction I was making last time in referring to Novitas Mundi, neither a question of self-affirmation or self-denial. Why? Not because affirmation and denial per se are bad ideas any more than control. I mean, well, I have to be careful here. Control depends on the context, right? But the real point in both of those, self-control and controlling others, self-affirmation and self-denial, the reason why those are not properly constituents of the thinking now occurring is the self that they have in common, the self-referral that they have in common. That's the key thing.